Okay, I want to talk a bit about type in Illustrator. I'm going to go to the type, select the type tool from the tool panel. And because there are other tools underneath here I want to show you in a minute, I'm going to hold it down until this pops up and then tear off this little palette. So I have this little floating panel here, which I will use the other features. I'll show you a few of the other features shortly. The first type of type is called point type. And in Illustrator, point type basically is an insertion spot. You can keep typing. Basically, if you kept typing, you would eventually hit the edge of the workspace. So point type is used for if you just want a small bit of type. Nothing contains it. So if you just need a small bit of type, you're going to start out with point type. A couple of things here. You can change the typeface. You can change the type weight. You can change the size. You can change the alignment, or in this case you probably wouldn't want to. I can just click and start typing. Okay, and basically that's all there is to it here. If you want more options, by the way, if you go under the window menu and pull your cursor down to where it says type and click on character, or alternatively hit Command or Control T, it should bring up the character, paragraph, and open type panels, which give you a few more options. So I'm going to select this block of type here. And I'm just going to show you a few things here. I could make it bigger here, so let's just make it really big. Let's just say this is some display type that I want. So this is the size. This is the leading, which isn't really going to make any difference if you only have one line of type. This is kerning, and kerning controls the distance between the individual letters. So some typefaces, and this one is actually not bad, but because of the way the letters are designed, even when they're evenly spaced, the gap between some looks bigger than the gap between others. So kerning allows you to control that. The first thing I usually suggest is just to see how it works. Illustrator has something called optical kerning here, which means this is Illustrator's best guess as to how this type should look. And if I click on optical, you can see it tightens it up a little bit. If I decide that maybe the O and the R look further apart just because of their shape, and actually in this case they don't look too bad, but if you want to tweak them individually, you can click your cursor in between those letters, and you can see that I can actually make the space smaller, or I can go one unit at a time. The units are actually quite small, so you'll have to move it quite a few of them to make a big difference. And that allows you, so I'll click my cursor in here and click on the minus. Again, it's moving them closer together. You'd normally do this only with big pieces of display type. And like I said, many typefaces now, optical kerning will give you pretty good results. The other thing you can do, and I'll select this whole block of type again, is called tracking. And what that does is it changes the space between all of the letters and the words. So if I go to 100 here, you can see it moves them quite far away. If I go to minus 100, it squeezes them quite close together. You probably wouldn't do this very often, although some typefaces, especially at small sizes and especially on screen, look better with a little bit of extra tracking. So you can see it's just moved it a little further apart. It's all about legibility, so make sure you take a look at it. Okay, so I'm going to go and unselect that, move it out of the way. I'm going to go back to my text tool here. I could also select it here. If you want to put type in a frame, in other words, you want type to be contained, you can click and drag and draw a frame, and then the type will automatically fill. Again, we've got the placeholder text here. Now I've got some weird things going on here. First off, Probably wouldn't want it to be 21 point. So let's try 12, which is a good screen size. The second thing you probably want is to change what's called the leading. And I'm going to change this for now to auto, just so you can see. If we want more placeholder text in here, just to fill this frame up, I can go into the type menu and go fill with placeholder text, and that adds more text in here. And I'm going to hit return so I have a paragraph space. Okay, leading is the different distance between the baseline of one line and the baseline of the next one. Leading, usually you want to look very closely at the legibility. Some typefaces, like Myriad, are better with a little bit more leading. It makes it easier to read. So let's go to some look better with a little less leading. What you need to do is see what it looks like with that amount of leading and just, is it readable? And I think we still have all of the tracking on there too, so I'm going to turn the tracking back to 0. Illustrator remembers the last thing you did here. A couple of other things you can do once you've got several paragraphs here is to select it all and go to the paragraph panel. And that's where you can select, do you want it centered, do you want it aligned right, do you want it justified? Justified is a little risky because sometimes what happens with justified text is, especially if you have big type or short columns, you don't have, this isn't very wide, you'll find that you get big gaps happening when it tries to justify it. Flush left is probably safer. Another decision to make when you have more than one paragraph is how do you want to handle the first line? How do you want to be able to tell people that there is a new paragraph there? And the two most common ways are, number one, to use a first line indent, which is usually equivalent to about the type height. So first line indent here, you can see that that shows you where the paragraphs are. Incidentally, the first line is usually not indented. The other way to tell people, to tell your reader that there's a paragraph there, is to use what's called space before and space after. For just paragraph spacing, it doesn't really make that big a difference. So if I click this is space before, and you can see it's basically just moving the lines apart. So two ways to handle change in paragraphs in text. Open type basically changes a few features here. Let's just see, we've got different types of numbers. So I'll just create a little and highlight that and say, do you want tabular lining numbers or do you want old style numbers where they sit on different baselines? Again, a judgment call, lining numbers, old style numbers. There are also a few other, depending on the typeface, and different typefaces will have different open type functions. Another thing is ligatures. So when I type the word office, you can see this is a ligature where the F joins onto the I. Instead of having a dot over the I, which will run into that top part of the F, it joins the two of them together, so that's a ligature. So those are some open type features that you might want to add to your type. Okay, also under the type tool, there are a couple of other options here. And if I look at this one here, this is called area type. And the area type tool would be used if you wanted to put your type inside a shape. So if I click on this with the area type tool, the type stays inside the circle. Looks a little bit weird here at the bottom. I'm not going to claim to be an aficionado of that, but it can work sometimes. So the type is basically staying inside that elliptical shape. I changed it to align center under the paragraph options because it looks a little bit better that way. The third tool is path type, and in this case you would click your type tool, the path type tool, on a path. In this case I've just drawn this with the curvature tool. You'll have to remember that with path type tool, your type actually is inside a container here. So when I click on the selection tool, the black arrow tool, you can see the ends of the container here, and you actually also have a little center thing here. So if you want to move your type along that path, let's say I want to start it right at the beginning of the path, if I can, you can see that I'm able to move the type. Again, this is something you'd probably use mostly for special effects and be useful. There's also type on a path options, most of which you're never going to use. Rainbow is probably the most legible, but just to show you that they're all here. Most of these are going to seriously affect your legibility. So that's path type. Again, select the path type tool and click it on any path. Of course, you could change the color of the type very easily. And basically, you're just going to select the type and go to the color panel or the swatches panel and just choose your color here. Now, it is actually possible to add a stroke around the text as well, but I recommend that you don't do this because unless it's a super narrow stroke, it's going to change the outline. It's going to cut into the shape of the typeface. So a black stroke here, you can see it's cutting into it. And oddly enough, even though it's something that you think it might, you can't change the alignment to the outside. So be very, very wary. Use only a very narrow stroke. If you feel that your type needs a stroke around the outside, use only a very narrow stroke because it will change the shape of the typeface, the shape of the letters.